Up next is our final invited talk. We're really excited to have Chris Nowinski here. Some of you may know him better as Chris Harvard from the Sports Legacy Institute. He's going to be talking about concussion research, and it's a great talk. So I'm excited. Please help me welcome Chris to the stage. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for spending time with me to talk about concussions. This is actually a new talk for me. I put the information together over the last few days, but it's an exciting time in the world of concussions because technology is rapidly improving as to assessment of concussions in a lot of different ways. Removal from play, return to play, and even the concept called hit counts, which we're going to get into. So I wanted to kind of explore some of the way this will work and how it's probably going to change sports in some very interesting ways. I do have a couple disclosures. I'm a consultant for MC10, and I have a financial relationship with the owner of the King-Dievik test, although I do not work with the King-Dievik test, but I will mention it. For those of you who don't know my history, I played football at Harvard. Like most Harvard graduates, went on to work with WWE as a pro wrestler. Surprisingly, got too many concussions, had to retire. Got very interested in this as I was trying to recover, wrote a book called Head Games, and that led to a lot of starting the Sports Legacy Institute in 2007 when we realized that we weren't handling concussions right. And the reality is we're doing a lot better now, but we're still not handling concussions right, and we still don't get all the complexities of them. One of the smartest things we did was partner with BU School of Medicine, so we're starting to get an appreciation for what the long-term consequences are, which are much more dire than I think people recognize. We have a brain bank. Some of you have heard of athletes donating their brains to science. So we have 500 who are living, who are going to donate. We have 105 brains now in the bank, over 35 former NFL players. We find a lot of bad news when we look at their brains. So right now the way we work is that SLI is trying to kind of take these findings from BU on the long-term consequences and turn them a lot into policy. And so a lot of this will be a discussion of policy and prevention and how do you not destroy the brains of the next generation of athletes who are playing sports like we have many of the prior generation, including someone like Dave Duerson, who is worth talking about as we talk about the consequences and what we're dealing with. Those of you who don't know his story, Dave, about 1 year ago now, committed suicide, shot himself in the heart to preserve his brain, and left this note asking that we would study his brain. We now act as the NFL's brain bank. He had been having problems with headaches. He had been having problems for about 5 years. Before his death at the age of 50. You know, those of you who know Dave Duerson, there was an article yesterday talking about how they tried to convince him to run against Barack Obama for Senate in 2007. He was that much of considered a leader, a multimillionaire from business. Fast forward to last year, he'd lost all his money and was 20 years in debt from a series of bad business decisions. His short-term memory had dissolved in a major way. He developed major problems with impulse control. He was kicked off the board of trustees of Notre Dame University for hitting his wife in public, hit his kids. His wife divorced him. Kids didn't talk to him. Killed himself while he was alone. He was right that he had this disease. What we'd look for in a brain, just so you understand a little bit of the science, is the presence of an abnormal protein called tau that signifies that the axons have been destroyed or are diseased in the area. And the brown stains are Dave Duerson. So a normal person would have none of that. You can see in very important parts of his brain, including his frontal cortex, including his hippocampus, responsible for memory, his amygdala, responsible for impulse control and emotions, all very, very diseased. So this is what we're trying to prevent. And how can we get there? Technology is going to help us in a big way. What I first want to talk about is the concussion issue. And the reality is that we are terrible at diagnosing concussions right now. And we are getting better, but we're still not very good in reality with determining when it's safe for someone to return to play. So the question I ask myself is, what happens when we do get good at it? What happens with the help of all the technology that's really on the cusp right now? What happens when we actually are able to spot every concussion and hold people out for as long as they really medically should be held out based on the standards we're only using today? So from the concussion side, what we're trying to avoid is what many of you know as the window of vulnerability. The idea that once you have a concussion, it starts a cascade of events that leaves your brain vulnerable. And further trauma, both physical and cognitive, causes that to become much more damaging, take longer to recover, perhaps lead to permanent deficits. It's the same concept of you broke your leg and you kept playing on it, it's going to get dramatically worse. You have to create a window of time for that to recover. So that is the major goal with resting everybody that we are trying to hold out now. That's why Sidney Crosby's still out. That's why it was ridiculous to see Kobe Bryant back in 3 days after he was concussed. Technologically, though, we cannot determine when a concussion has happened. The reality is we don't have any technology that says with 100% accuracy that was a concussion. We are going on signs and symptoms. We are going on what is in reality relatively primitive tests that tell us there's some sort of deficit after trauma. Concussions don't show up on imaging. They don't show up on the standard CTs or MRIs. So if we're not going to get to the Star Trek world anytime soon where you can wave something over somebody's head, another way to be able to spot concussions in real time very quickly might be the combination of two things. Better on-field indicators of when a hit is hard enough to cause a concussion, and then better sideline assessments to help determine and verify if that concussion happened. So the reality is if we had this technology, we would be spotting a lot more concussions. The data says that if you go by diagnosed concussions by programs that have athletic trainers, you get about 5% of athletes in every contact and collision sport that are diagnosed each year, whether it's football, ice hockey, lacrosse, soccer, rugby. 1 out of 20 people are diagnosed right now. What is ignored in the literature is the athlete surveys that take out the word concussion, ask them after the season and anonymously, how many times were you hit and experienced these symptoms after a blow? And those numbers are more like 50%. And that means people are getting multiple. In the Langbert study, it was the average person suffered 3 dings per season. So we're talking about much higher numbers. Hockey, a great study found the same thing by Eklund. They took a group of 16 to 21-year-olds. They said, you have an athletic trainer. With this other group, we're going to put a doctor. Here's high tech for you. Put a doctor in the stands to look for concussion symptoms, liberally pull people out who we saw skating sideways, and test them for concussion using what we have now. He found 7 times as many concussions. The normal group was 5%. He found 35%. 1/3 were pulled out just by putting someone in the stands with the ability to pull people out. And that is much closer to the reality that we live in, but that's not even the reality we live in. Another study that had put observers in the stands found that they only saw 50% of the symptoms that the players reported. So with the women in that study, for every 1 concussion they caught, the observers thought they saw 33 and thought they were way overestimating. Then they surveyed the athletes and it was 54. So we are probably diagnosing between 2 and 10% of concussions, okay? The reality is we can't see the injury and we're getting by on that. These sports are kind of existing in this world where we think concussions are serious, we're going to hold people out. But because we can't see them, people aren't out of the game. That's an injury you could see and we would take seriously. You're not going to miss that. So the idea is, what if you can get something, start with something on their head, whether it's a helmet, whether it's a headband, whether it's a mouthpiece that can register hits. And this is something that's being pushed and marketed by a few companies right now, some of them in very unethical ways. But the idea is you have maybe a red light, green light system. The red light means that you've been hit so hard that it's some risk of concussion. But the reality is we don't know where to set those things, because every hit is an S-curve risk of concussion. Everything at 10 Gs, no one's ever gotten a concussion at 10 Gs that we know of. But if you get up to 300 Gs of linear acceleration, yeah, everyone's going to get a concussion. But in between, it's just a curve. So if you set it at 50, you've got that red light going off all the time. And then you have a problem with people coming out of the game, because the reality is if you're going to put that system in place, which people are trying to, you're going to have to evaluate each person who has that red light. Well, what if you put it at 100? You're going to have fewer red lights go off, but you may miss concussions that are happening at 60 Gs or 70 Gs. What if you put it at 150? It's going to go off, once every few games, and you're really not helping anybody, because we know we've got a lot more concussions going on at the lower levels. So that is one question that we're dealing with. And one of the other issues is, if you want to have an indicator on somebody's head, what you need is a very good sideline assessment to determine if they're safe to go back in. Because the ideal situation is you have something very fast on the sideline. It takes less than 1 minute. You set that level very low. You pull people out every time they're getting a hit over 80 Gs, 100 Gs. Then you know immediately whether or not they can go back in. And then it's not disruptive to the game. You get buy-in from people. People are magically safer. Right now, we don't have that. The other alternative is we have what we have today, which is a 20-minute evaluation called the SCAT-2 that's never been validated, and each component part individually cannot determine when it's safe to return to play. They've just thrown them together in a 105-point score. It's the best we can do, but it's not good. And if you have to pull everybody out against that red light 20 minutes and evaluate them, and you have a low yield, and you're only catching 10% of them actually have concussions, no one's going to use it. It's not a very helpful system at all in the reality of the sports that we live in. So, and then the other problem you add on to there is the culture of sport. And this is something I spent the summer in Europe last year at an Eisenhower Fellowship trying to spread the awareness that we have here there. I remember meeting with international rugby, talking about the fact that in soccer and rugby at the elite levels, you don't have substitutions. You get 3 substitutions a game, a fixed number, which means it's really hard to pull people out and evaluate them for injury because once they're pulled out, they stay out. I was actually prompted by some European rugby doctors who want to see them create what they call a brain bin over there, a 20-minute window where you can substitute somebody back in if you do think they've had a concussion. So you can evaluate them, because I think, as an ex-athlete, you show concussion symptoms on the field, you deserve to get a medical evaluation. It's your brain. You only get one of them. Bad things happen if we don't take care of it. And I pointed out that in rugby and soccer, you can come out and go back in for blood. So if you get a cut, you can actually come out and get stitched and go back in. They don't count that against substitution. So if we could bleed out of our ears with a concussion, they would let us get evaluated and come back in, but we can't. They're refusing to change the rules. So that will change in the next few years, and I promise you, unless we get that sideline test that works. One test that is promising is King-Dievik. If you go look at the 2 papers that have been published on pro athlete, boxers, MMA fighters, and college athletes at Penn, it did very successfully find concussions in less than a 1-minute test comparing people's baselines. You can look into the test on yourself of what it is. But something like that, or that test, will be a game changer in terms of now you've got a sensor you can set low, and you can pull people out and do a 45-second evaluation and feel comfortable returning them if they pass their baseline. So that would work. But the question is then, what if we do that? If we do that, here's the problem. You get 50% of players suffering concussions each year. Average person, let's say, is out 10 days. The science is iffy on that. How many days would you miss? Well, if you do the quick math, and I did this kind of on the plane on the way here today, so if I'm wrong, don't have the MIT people make fun of me. But you have a 50-person football team, half of them get concussions, 10 days, 250 days. Do the math, that's about 4% of playing days for the season. Not completely disruptive to the game. But what's another element that we're missing here? That's concussion management. We're not very good at concussion management right now. So if you go read some of the more interesting studies that have been coming out recently, what we're finding out is the window of vulnerability that we believe exists is dramatically longer than we realize. And it's funny to think about, because only in 2008 we were still putting athletes back into the game within 15 minutes if they cleared up on the sideline, because we thought that window was really short. The reality is we know it's much longer. In rats, it's 7 to 10 days. Well, now that we have better, more research-oriented tests, magnetic resonance spectroscopy, fMRI, looking at blood flow, evoked potentials, what we're finding is that no one seems to recover to baseline on the really difficult tests within 30 days. So your brain is abnormal, and I'm with a short time, I have to use broad concepts here, so don't criticize the science, but basically the MRS stuff, the fMRI stuff said no one recovers within 30 days. Their brain is abnormal. And if it's abnormal, what we believe now, what we're living by, is if you're abnormal on your baseline neuropsychological test, you can't go back in. So if we actually gave everyone an fMRI, well, you would be abnormal there, and suddenly you're at 30 days. So let's just do some math and say, well, what if the average becomes 60 days? Because our tests get so good that we can test very subtle abnormalities that we couldn't test before. Well, you start running the math on that, you start to get, a 50-person team, 25 of them with concussions, not even counting people get repeat concussions during the year, an average of 60 days out, you're now losing 21% of playing days. So the reality is, if we got really good at diagnosing concussions and really good at determining return to play, you would have 1 out of 5 athletes out at all times. You would have 1 player on your basketball team, well, maybe not basketball, but hockey, ice hockey, you'd have 1 of your starters out for hockey. You'd have 4 guys out on your football team every week out of your starting group. So I say that to point out that we're going into kind of uncharted territory with this technology. I hope we get really good at assessing concussions. I hope we get really much better at managing them. But we're going to then, therefore, really have to change the sports. The two questions come up. How do you play the games if this is the situation? And then, why do you play the games? If the reality is 1 out of 5 people has a concussion all the time, is it really a good idea? Is it really safe? Or are we all going to end up with Dave Duerson's brain? So we have to think about the health of athletes in this. It doesn't just become an analytics issue. We don't know enough about what's contributing to CT right now. We do know that most people aren't getting this, but I do know, I'll tell you, if you came to our brain bank and looked at everyone who played collision sports for more than 10 years, over 90% have the disease. And we're talking about an N of 50. So it's a biased sample, but it's not that biased. This is far more widespread than we realized. But we, more than we've realized, become impaired. And, actually, out of our first, we've stopped counting because the numbers are getting depressing, but our first 25 college and pro football players we studied, 19 pro football players, 6 college, all but 1 had this pathology. So we don't know what this level is. To close, conceptually, another way to look at this is to throw out all the concussion stuff I just talked about. Because what we're realizing is that concussions aren't the only problem. Subconcussive blows to the head are a major issue. The idea of hits to the head that don't actually cause clinical symptoms and abnormalities on the tests we're using now, we're finding out do show abnormalities on more sophisticated tests. It's the idea that if it's 100, say your threshold is 100 G's of linear force. If you took that, you have symptoms, that's concussion. What happens when you get hit at 99 and it doesn't cause you clinical symptoms? Did you just suffer a brain injury? The reality is, yes, you almost certainly did, but you just physically can't feel it, and we're not using normal tests that'll see it. But researchers at Purdue, researchers at a few other places using more sophisticated tests are finding abnormalities in people who claim they're fine, that they never had any symptoms after hits. So at the Super Bowl, the NFL actually let us have the press conference announcing that we want to get to a hit count, because the NFL's becoming very supportive of this work, and it's very exciting. We based it off the idea of a pitch count, that everyone here knows that pitch counts exist in baseball. They're a new fad. The idea is there's a little bit of data saying you throw too much in a day or a year and your elbow will wear out over time. Well, we are providing a lot of evidence that you get hit in the head too much, your brain will wear out as well. And I live in a world where I think the brain is more important than the elbow. So if we're going to set a restriction on something for children, it should be their brain trauma before we do elbows. Okay, that's just me. So the idea is, if you're 10 years old, you can only throw 75 times. If you're 11, you throw 85. That's clearly not based on much science if every number ends on 5. And that's okay. I'm fine with it. We are never going to get to that perfect science, but there are people out there who need this protection. And then they add in mandatory rest. 61 pitches, you are required to have 3 days of rest. I mean, this would be so great for the brain if we could do this, but we don't do this yet. We still have full contact 4 days a week at Pop Warner. So the idea is, what is happening at the brain? We know that this is bad. And we know that some level of low hits is probably completely fine, okay? You bump your head a little bit, you're fine. But there's this unknown in the middle where between something up to concussive levels is probably damaging. So let's take that number down. If we take that number down, we're also taking down risk of concussion. The numbers are quite high. Now that we can put sensors in helmets, we're finding out in football and ice hockey, the average person takes somewhere between 500 and 1,000 blows in college football. High school, some poor kid took 2,235 blows in 3 months that exceeded 10 G's. Seems like a lot to me, having gone through that. Hockey players are even averaging 200, 300, 400. Some people are getting up near 1,000. So we're getting to high numbers. Now the question is, okay, now we got to set a line. What's the number you can't go over? Well, I don't know. No one knows what that is, but we're going to have to pick it out. If you look at football, it turns out the positions are all about the same in terms of average force, but total impacts is much different. Your average wide receiver is going to be under 400, but your average lineman is going to be near 1,000 or well over 1,000. So if you had to pluck a number out of thin air and said everyone should be under 500, well, suddenly you've got linemen and running backs and linebackers who can't finish the season if we do things the way we're doing them now, if we say that number's too high. So what we are focused on is reducing hitting in practice. That's the #1 way that we can restrict total counts in soccer and in football. This idea that most of the exposure comes there. In fact, in football, it's up to 75%. The brain trauma exposure is happening in practice. And so we can get those numbers down, and people are buying into this. If you watch the CBA, the NFL and the NFLPA negotiating, the NFLPA pushed for 14 practice days with contact in 18 weeks. So the toughest men in the world said, stop hitting me in the head so much. What's the point? And then the Ivy League followed suit, and I'm not going to say, I mentioned I was on both committees and pushed these like crazy, but the Ivy League followed suit and said, all right, we're going to limit, NCAA allows 5 days of hitting a week, we're going to make it 2, and we're going to keep trying to push it down. And then Pop Warner, the executive director, announced after he came to our press conference, he said they're going to restrict hitting in Pop Warner from 6 hours a week down to 2 hours a week. That's what he's going to push for as a rule by next season. So we are starting to buy into this, but we have to figure out what level is safe, and we're going to have to change the games appropriately, or you're going to find out that some players have to stop at some point during the season because we're going to go, this is stupid. Another idea that's going to come is that, especially with youth, you're not going to play 3 contact sports in a year. You're not going to go from football to ice hockey to soccer, because if you add in 2,000 in football, so you get 1,000 in ice hockey, another couple thousand in soccer, probably no child, and I'll go out on a limb here and say probably no child take 5,000 hits to the head a year. That's just me. But we are doing it now. Soccer headers is another big area because research by Lipton, that was an unpublished study yet, but doing DTI, diffusion tensor imaging, found they interviewed guys, they took up to 5,000 headers a year. They found that those with over 1,300 were more likely to have cognitive abnormalities and imaging abnormalities in their early 30s. So the other issue is that attempting headers also leads to many of the concussions that happen because you're colliding with people head to head, elbow to head. So what do? Do you get rid of headers? We're going to have these conversations. My intelligence says that the soccer community is going to fight saying headers are dangerous, but the reality is they are. And we're going to have to do something like raising the age for heading or ban headers of the ball that come off the goalie's foot, because those are the ones carrying, that are going the highest and carrying the most force, or limit exposure. And do you limit exposure just for children, or do you limit exposure for adults too? We have to have that conversation about whether can adults do dangerous jobs. How much protection do the adults need when they know the risk is coming? Because the reality is the kids need a lot more. There is no such thing as informed consent. We need to change, and we need to start really separating what we do with adults and what we do with kids. We don't have to go as far with the adults as we do with the kids, but the reality is that we don't make those changes unless the adults do it first. Nothing happened in youth football until the NFL has done it first, but the NFL is going to stop eventually, and youth is going to have to go farther. And I'm curious how we're going to get there without a big fight. So in conclusion, new data, new analytics are being developed, and the 4 most interesting areas in this world to me are hit indicators, sideline assessment, return to play, and hit counts. And for all 4 of those, technology is going to explode, and then we have to figure out how we're going to incorporate that technology into the games and how we're going to change the games, because the reality is that everything's interconnected, but if we're able to diagnose every concussion and we're able to diagnose every abnormality in the brain, we're able to count every hit, we wouldn't have enough players on the field based on the medical guidelines that we have today. So either we're going to have to become much more liberal with our guidelines, which won't happen, or we're going to have to dramatically change the games and change as we are better able to measure the exposure and the consequences. And I look forward to working with all of you to make those games safer. Thank you very much. With time for questions? Great. He's in charge. Oh, good, okay.
Talk a little bit about technology and what you've seen around technology as far as concussion prevention and new equipment, and maybe the slippery slope that presents as new technologies come out. Okay, I've got this technology now. I can run full force in a situation where I wouldn't have before, and then obviously that doesn't impact sports like soccer. For the most part, although there is a helmet available. Talk a little bit about that technology.
Sure, happy to focus on the kind of shoulder pads, helmets world and prevention. I am a firm believer right now in not adding helmets to anything, because you look, football and ice hockey historically became more dangerous. It involved more blows to the head with greater force. And once we added helmets are really there to primarily prevent skull fractures first. So I would say that the helmet technology will continue to evolve, will continue to get better, and it will make incremental gains, and that will be good. But we have to, the bigger gains we have to make are the rules around how you use them. And I think one of the more interesting conversations happening right now in that world is ice hockey and getting rid of the armor. And I know Brendan Shanahan is pushing this over there, and we're trying to support him in a big way. The idea that once you take away pain from collisions, you make the game dramatically more dangerous for one of them. If you carry more force in a collision, you win, congratulations. But if you lose, you're in big trouble. So the person initiating should also feel some pain. So no more hard shoulder pads, no more hard elbow pads, and I think that's the direction we'll be heading. So it'll be interesting to try to go backwards because everyone thinks technology is the answer, but in this sense, not as much.
Hey, you mentioned how you thought it was ridiculous that Kobe Bryant was playing 3 days after he was concussed. Is this something that you think athletes should have a choice in determining whether they can play or not? Because I think if you gave Kobe Bryant the choice, he would want to play. He likes to play through injury, and obviously he scored 38 points last night. Is it something that you think athletes should have a choice in determining whether they can play or not, depending on the type of concussion they have?
That's actually a really good question. And I'll probably surprise you. I think there's two ways to look. First, you have to get to is everybody truly informed? And I will tell you right now that less than 1% of professional athletes are truly informed of the risks because everybody I talk to has dramatic misunderstandings. And only literally like 4 professional athletes have ever bothered to reach out and say, tell me what's going on, come visit the brain bank, look around, talk to the doctors. There's not a lot of interest. So right now, I guarantee you Kobe, wanting to go back because he's a tough guy, did not know the risks to his career and did not consider him becoming Sidney Crosby if he took another bad blow to the head, not understanding the way axons fall apart and all of that with a concussion. So it was, I mean, I just can't believe somebody didn't say, let's not be stupid here and put him back in. But once athletes are informed, I think there is going to be an interesting discussion about whether or not, if it's the last game of the playoffs, if it's the Super Bowl, can you go back while you're still symptomatic? And part of me, I can push that conversation off because I know, A, not everyone's informed, and I know, B, we need the athletes to set the right example for at least a few years so that kids learn to get it. We can't have Brian Urlacher out there saying that I'm going to hide concussions. It's just so bad. So we can't allow that for a period of time. I'm going to say no one goes back while they're symptomatic for 10 years. But then after that, maybe you can. Because the reality is, there's always a chance of, death on the field or something, and you are going to have, you can, and I said it in the New York Times article on fighting. You can trade brain cells for money in sports, and a lot of people do it. And so that'll be an interesting ethical discussion when we get there.
I was just going to ask you, has there been any sort of breakthrough on the tau, I think it is, for the CTE in terms of determining whether or not people have a predisposition to it? And has there been any sort of exploration as to whether or not there's any sort of validity to the idea that individuals are more likely to be exposed to that?
Good question. Genetic predisposition. At this point, it is completely unknown. There's only one gene that's even on people's radar screen called ApoE4. The data is out of our early studies is trending that you might have a 2, 3, 4 times greater risk of the disease if you have that. But it's off of a small sample right now. And so, and right now it appears, based on you look at these college and NFL guys and NHL hockey players who are 4 for 4, that everyone's exceeding whatever threshold that is, no matter what their genes are. So I don't think we're ever going to find that there's some magic predetermining gene. Although we are starting, there's so many people that passing away that we actually have some families now. We actually have a father-son in the brain bank who both have less tau than everybody else. So we may find something interesting about them. But I'm going to say it's very rare, and let's not hang our hats on hoping that there's some magic gene. All right. Well, I'll end there. Thank you so much for your time.